The HFY Dominion had spent centuries exploring the stars, cataloging and classifying every intelligent species they encountered. Their research vessels drifted across the void, gathering samples, studying biology, and unlocking the secrets of evolution. They had dissected thousands of life forms, breaking down their genetic codes until nothing remained unknown. To them, the universe had no more surprises. That belief shattered the moment they found the human. Commander Elias Carter drifted in the wreckage of his ship, his suit's emergency systems keeping him barely alive. His vessel, the Icarus, had been a deep space research craft, lost in an uncharted sector after a catastrophic failure. The distress beacon had long since gone silent, his oxygen levels dwindling with every hour. He had accepted that he would die alone, another forgotten soul swallowed by the endless black. Then the aliens arrived. The HFY survey ship Veruan detected the wreckage first, its sensors sweeping the debris field with clinical precision. At first, the crew assumed it was nothing more than another derelict vessel from a lesser species. They had seen countless primitive ships, their inhabitants long dead. But when they scanned the life signs, they found something impossible. A single human, alive, against all odds. Dr. Varlek, the chief scientist aboard the Veruan, leaned forward, his elongated fingers tapping rapidly against his control panel. The readings made no sense. The human should have been dead. His body had suffered extreme trauma, oxygen deprivation, cellular decay, radiation exposure, yet he still clung to life. More than that, his vitals were stabilizing instead of deteriorating. "This is not possible," Varlek muttered, his voice a low hiss. His assistant, a junior researcher named Kelvon, peered over his shoulder. "Perhaps the sensors are malfunctioning," she suggested. Varlek shook his head. The Dominion's technology was flawless. If the human was alive, it was because something in his biology was keeping him that way. The order was given. The human was retrieved from the wreckage and placed into a sterile containment chamber aboard the Veruan. Every precaution was taken. The HFY had strict protocols when dealing with unknown life forms, and though humans were not new to them, this particular case was different. Elias regained consciousness slowly. His body ached, his head throbbed, and when he finally forced his eyes open, he found himself staring at alien figures beyond a transparent barrier. Their forms were tall and sleek, with smooth gray skin and large, dark eyes that held neither cruelty nor kindness, only a cold scientific curiosity. He had read about the HFY before. The Dominion rarely interacted with humans, considering them an inferior species barely worth acknowledging. So why had they rescued him? He tried to sit up, but his limbs felt heavy. A faint hum filled the chamber, and he realized the air smelled sterile, almost artificial. His suit was gone, replaced by a thin medical gown. He was being studied. Beyond the barrier, Dr. Varlek observed the human with quiet fascination. He had expected Elias to be disoriented, perhaps weak from prolonged exposure to the void. But instead, the human's eyes were sharp, alert. His body language did not show panic or desperation, only calculated awareness. A remarkable resilience, Varlek mused. Kelvon, reviewing the biological scans, suddenly froze. "Doctor, there's something wrong with the genetic analysis." Varlek turned sharply. "Explain." She hesitated, double-checking the data before speaking. "His DNA, it's not static. It's adapting. There are active sequences rewriting themselves in real time." Varlek stared at the screen, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. This was not natural. Every species followed the same evolutionary principles, their genetic structure set from birth. Mutations took generations to manifest, but this human was changing at this very moment. Elias, unaware of the full extent of their findings, watched the aliens with growing unease. He could feel their scrutiny, the weight of their stares. He had no weapons, no way to escape, but he knew one thing. He could not afford to be their experiment. He forced himself to breathe steadily, pushing past the exhaustion. He had survived impossible odds before. Whatever was happening, whatever they had discovered about him, he would find a way to turn it to his advantage. The HFY had no idea what they had just uncovered, and neither did Elias. But soon, the entire galaxy would learn the truth. You said. The moment Elias realized he was being watched, he forced himself to stay calm. His mind was racing, his instincts screaming at him to find a way out. He had no idea how long he had been unconscious, but he knew one thing for sure. The HFY were not his rescuers. They were his captors. Through the transparent barrier, their dark, expressionless eyes followed his every move. Their elongated fingers moved across glowing control panels, collecting data about his body. He could see faint reflections of himself in the glass, his skin pale, his muscles weak from exposure to the void. Yet, deep inside, he felt different. He clenched his fist. A sharp pulse ran up his arm, a sensation he had never felt before. Something had changed inside him. On the other side of the glass, Dr. Varlek was speaking in hushed tones to Kelvin. The data they had gathered so far defied everything they knew about biology. Human DNA was supposed to be rigid, bound by the same natural laws that governed all life. But this human, this one man, was rewriting those laws with every passing second. Kelvin hesitated. Doctor, if his genetic code is unstable, should we place him in stasis? Varlek didn't respond immediately. His sharp gaze was locked onto Elias, studying the way he moved, the way his muscles tensed and relaxed. Not yet, Varlek finally said. I want to see how far this change goes. Inside the containment chamber, Elias could feel something stirring beneath his skin. A warmth, a power, humming just below the surface. He didn't know what the HFY had done to him, or if this was something his body had done on its own, but he knew he had to act fast. They were studying him. That meant he was valuable. And if he was valuable, that meant they wouldn't kill him yet. Elias pressed his palm against the glass. The HFY scientists tensed, but he only tilted his head, giving them a tired smirk. You know, he said, his voice rough from dehydration, if you wanted me alive, you could have just asked nicely. The aliens didn't respond. They never spoke directly to their subjects. The Dominion considered lesser species unworthy of conversation. That was fine. Elias didn't need them to talk. He needed them to make a mistake. Varlek turned to his assistant. Increase the containment field's energy output. I want to see if his body reacts. Kelvin hesitated again. Doctor, if his cellular structure is unstable. Do it. The moment the energy level surged, Elias felt it. A sharp electric sensation raced through his veins, but instead of pain, he felt something unlock inside him. His vision sharpened. His breathing steadied. His heartbeat slowed, not in weakness, but in control. A realization struck him. He wasn't just adapting. He was evolving. For the first time since waking up, Elias smiled. Varlek's eyes narrowed as he saw the human's expression. No test subject had ever smiled during an experiment before. No primitive species had ever enjoyed what was happening to them. The alarms went off before Varlek could react. Elias took a deep breath and clenched his fist again. This time, he felt it. The energy, the raw force running through him, waiting to be used. The containment field flickered. The HFY scrambled to adjust their instruments, but it was too late. Elias moved, faster than he ever had before, faster than any human should have. His fist slammed into the glass, and instead of bouncing off, the barrier shattered. The HFY recoiled in shock. They had never seen this before, a contained specimen breaking free. It was unthinkable. Elias stepped forward, breathing heavily, his body thrumming with power. He didn't know what had happened to him. He didn't know why his body was changing. But he knew one thing for sure. He was no longer just a man. and the XL-FAR were about to find out what that meant. You said. The moment the barrier shattered, silence fell over the XL-FAR observation chamber. The scientists stood frozen, their dark, expressionless eyes locked onto the human who had done the impossible. Elias took a slow, steady breath. The tingling sensation under his skin had grown stronger. It was no longer just an awareness of change. It was a presence, something within him that felt both familiar and entirely new. He glanced down at his hands. They looked the same, but he felt the difference. His muscles didn't ache, his body no longer trembled with exhaustion. He had been on the brink of death just hours ago, yet now he felt stronger than he ever had in his entire life. The XL-FAR moved at last. Dr. Varlek's voice was sharp and controlled. Seal the chamber. Containment protocol. Now. Elias had no intention of being contained again. Before the security barriers could activate, he moved. The XL-FAR barely had time to react. One moment, Elias stood inside the ruined containment cell. The next, he was on the other side of the room, moving with speed and precision no human should have possessed. He didn't know how he did it. He had just willed it, and his body had responded. Kelvon let out a sharp chirp of alarm, stumbling backward. Varlek was the only one who didn't move. His dark gaze stayed locked onto Elias, not with fear, but with something far more dangerous. Curiosity. Elias had seen that look before. It was the same look human scientists gave when they found a rare specimen. It wasn't admiration. It wasn't respect. It was ownership. They weren't afraid of him yet. That was a problem. Elias lunged forward. His body reacted faster than he could think, his instincts overriding conscious thought. His hand closed around Varlek's throat in a blur of motion. The alien stiffened, his elongated limbs twitching slightly, but he did not resist. Fascinating, Varlek murmured. His voice was strained but not panicked. Your muscles, your reflexes, this is beyond standard human capability. Elias squeezed. Yeah, he growled. Then what does that make me? Varlek's large black eyes gleamed. An anomaly. Before Elias could respond, the doors to the observation chamber slammed open. XL-FAR security forces poured in, their sleek, segmented armor gleaming under the bright artificial lights. They moved with inhuman coordination, their weapons already raised and primed. Energy rifles hummed as they locked onto their target. Elias, release the overseer. The lead officer's voice was cold and mechanical. Now. Elias didn't move. His grip on Varlek tightened just enough for the alien to feel it. He could sense the growing tension in the room. The soldiers were disciplined, their training absolute, but even they hesitated. They had never encountered something like this before. Do it, Varlek rasped. Elias studied the overseer's face, searching for deception, for any sign of a trap. But Varlek wasn't afraid. He was watching, measuring. Elias released him. Varlek stumbled slightly before straightening. He rubbed his throat but showed no sign of anger. If anything, he looked satisfied. You've confirmed my hypothesis, the overseer said, his voice smooth once more. Elias narrowed his eyes. And what's that? Varlek's lips curled slightly, the closest thing the XL-FAR had to a smile. That you, human, are the most valuable discovery the Dominion has ever made. The lead security officer took a step forward. Orders, overseer. Varlek's gaze never left Elias. Take him to the research wing. Prepare for full biological analysis. The soldiers surged forward. Elias reacted before he could think. His body moved, faster than even the XL-FAR could track. He twisted, ducked, and lashed out with force that sent the first guard crashing into the wall. Another swung his weapon, but Elias caught the barrel, snapping it in half with his bare hands. The others hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. That was all he needed. A surge of power shot through his limbs. He lunged, weaving between the soldiers with terrifying speed. His fist struck one in the chest, and the force sent them flying across the room. Another guard tried to grab him from behind. Elias grabbed his arm and twisted. The sickening crack of bone filled the air. Kelvon watched in stunned silence as the human tore through the elite Sci-Fi guards like they were nothing. "This is not possible," she whispered. Elias pivoted, slamming his elbow into the final soldier's helmet. The alien crumpled to the floor. Varlek stood motionless in the aftermath. He should have looked concerned, alarmed, afraid. But he didn't. He looked excited. Elias took a step toward him, his breathing steady despite the chaos. "Guess your little experiment didn't go as planned." Varlek tilted his head. "On the contrary," he murmured. "It went exactly as I had hoped." Elias stiffened. Then the floor collapsed beneath him. A containment field erupted around his body, stronger than before. His vision blurred as the energy pulsed through him, his limbs locking up against his will. He had been so focused on the fight, on survival, that he hadn't noticed the secondary trap waiting beneath his feet. Varlek approached the glowing field, his gaze filled with something Elias didn't like. "Hunger." "This confirms it," the overseer whispered, his voice thick with satisfaction. "You are no ordinary human." Elias struggled, but the containment field held him in place. Varlek leaned in close, his eyes gleaming. "You are something more." Elias hung in the containment field, his body paralyzed by the energy coursing through him. His mind, however, was racing. He had been too slow, too focused on the fight. He should have seen it coming. Varlek stood outside the shimmering barrier, his elongated fingers tapping against the control panel with precise, deliberate movements. His dark, pupil-less eyes studied Elias with something that was almost reverence. "You are a marvel," the overseer murmured. "The first proof of what we long suspected. Humanity was never meant to be just another species." Elias clenched his jaw. "What the hell are you talking about?" Varlek's lips curled into something resembling a smile. "You still don't see it, do you? Even after what you've done. The speed, the strength, the reaction time. Those are not enhancements. That is your natural state, buried beneath layers of genetic limitations." Elias narrowed his eyes. "You're saying I was, what? Suppressed?" Varlek's gaze gleamed. "Exactly." A cold chill ran through Elias. The overseer believed this. More than that, he was certain of it. Kelvon stood a few feet away, her eyes flicking between Elias and the data streaming across the monitors. Unlike Varlek, her expression was unreadable. "The suppression field is holding," she said quietly. "But the readings are unstable." Varlek barely acknowledged her. He was focused entirely on Elias. "You should not exist," he said, his voice almost reverent. "Humans should not be capable of this. We studied your kind for centuries. Warriors, yes. Survivors, absolutely. But this..." He gestured toward the broken soldiers scattered across the room. "This is impossible." Elias exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain calm. Panic wouldn't help. Neither would anger. "Think." He tested his limbs again. The containment field held firm, but something was different this time. It didn't feel like before. It wasn't just restraining him. It was measuring him. The field wasn't just a prison. It was a test. Varlek turned away, typing something into the console. "We need to push further. See how deep the modifications go." Kelvon stiffened. "Overseer, we don't know if. We must." Varlek's voice was sharp. "If humanity has truly been limited, then we have the key to unlocking an evolutionary leap beyond anything the Dominion has ever seen." Elias felt a pulse through the containment field. His muscles tensed involuntarily. Something was pressing against his body, against his very cells. And then he felt it. Something deep, something old. It wasn't pain, exactly. It was more like remembering. Memories that weren't his, movements he had never made. A knowledge buried in his bones, waiting to be awakened. The containment field pulsed again, And Elias gasped. The universe shifted around him. For a single moment, he saw everything, not with his eyes, but with something else. He felt the weight of the station's structure, the hum of its power systems, the faint heartbeats of every HFY in the room. And then it was gone. Varlek's eyes were wide. Fascinating. Kelvan stepped closer to the console, her fingers dancing over the controls. His neural activity just spiked beyond measurable levels. This isn't normal. We're pushing too far. Varlek ignored her. Elias, he said softly, tell me, what did you see? Elias gritted his teeth. He didn't trust them, but he also knew he needed answers. So he told them the truth. I saw everything. Varlek's expression flickered with something almost like awe. Kelvan, however, looked disturbed. That shouldn't be possible, she murmured. This is beyond anything we've ever encountered. Varlek turned back to Elias. And now you understand why you cannot be allowed to leave. Elias smiled. And then the containment field shattered. It wasn't like before. He didn't strike it or push against it. It simply ceased to exist, collapsing under a force that even the HFY couldn't comprehend. Alarms blared. Security forces rushed into the room, weapons raised. Elias moved. And this time, he wasn't holding back. Elias hit the ground in a crouch as the containment field shattered around him. The room seemed to explode into chaos. HFY security forces rushed forward, their plasma weapons raised, but Elias was already moving. Something inside him had changed. It wasn't just strength or speed anymore. It was awareness. He could see their movements before they happened, anticipate every step, every reaction. The first guard fired. Elias twisted to the side, the plasma bolt scorching past his shoulder. His body reacted before his mind even processed it, and then he was inside the soldier's guard, slamming a fist into his chest. The impact sent the alien flying across the room. The others hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. It was all Elias needed. He surged forward, weaving between them like they were standing still. His hand caught the barrel of a rifle, twisting it upward just as another shot went off. The plasma blast struck the ceiling, and before the wielder could react, Elias tore the weapon from his hands and sent him sprawling with a single strike. Varlek was shouting something, but Elias wasn't listening. He had one goal: get out. Kelvan stood frozen near the console, her wide eyes locked onto him. Elias, stop, she called. He didn't. He couldn't. Then, pain. A blast from behind struck his back, sending a surge of electricity through his muscles. Elias staggered but didn't fall. He gritted his teeth and turned just as another soldier aimed. This time, he didn't dodge. Instead, he caught the blast. The energy arced through his fingers, crackling across his skin. But it didn't burn. It didn't hurt. It simply dissolved into him. The room fell dead silent. The soldiers stared at him in horror. Even Varlek took a step back. Elias looked down at his hands, flexing his fingers. He could feel the energy still thrumming beneath his skin. He had absorbed it. Somehow, instinctively, he had taken the raw power and made it his own. Kelvan spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. That shouldn't be possible. Elias met her gaze. Yeah, he muttered. I'm starting to hear that a lot. The soldiers didn't move. They weren't sure if they should attack, run, or simply stand there in fear. Elias could see it in their eyes. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were witnesses to something they didn't understand. Varlek, however, recovered quickly. This is precisely why you cannot leave, the overseer said, his voice calm but laced with urgency. You are more than you know, Elias, more than even humanity understands. If you walk out of here now, do you have any idea what the universe will do to you? Elias clenched his fists. He didn't know. Not really. But he wasn't about to stay and find out. A door to his left hissed open. Reinforcements. He could hear the footsteps of more troops coming. He needed a way out. Then, Kelvon moved. She stepped between him and Varlek, her hands raised in a clear act of defiance. Let him go. Varlek's expression darkened. Kelvon, step aside. No, she said. It was a single word, but the weight behind it stopped the room cold. Elias didn't understand why she was doing this. He barely knew her, but there was no time to question it. Kelvon moved to the console and deactivated the lockdown. Varlek's eyes widened. You don't know what you're doing. Yes, she said quietly. I do. Elias didn't wait for an explanation. The second the doors unlocked, he ran. The station was a maze, but somehow he knew exactly where to go. His feet carried him effortlessly through the corridors, past confused personnel, past security teams too slow to react. The hangar was close. So close. Then, alarms blared. A voice echoed through the station's comms. Security alert. Subject is attempting escape. Activate planetary lockdown. Elias's blood ran cold. They weren't just trying to stop him. They were trying to trap him forever. You said. Elias sprinted through the corridor, his heart pounding like a war drum. The alarms blared across the station, flashing red lights bathing the metallic walls in an eerie glow. He knew he didn't have much time. If the planetary lockdown went into full effect, he was never getting off this station. Footsteps pounded behind him. Security forces giving chase. He could hear their weapons charging, the hum of energy building. A voice echoed over the speakers. Varlek. Stop running, Elias. You don't understand what's at stake. Elias ignored him. He had heard enough. He didn't care about the stakes. He only knew one thing. He wasn't staying here. He turned a corner and nearly crashed into Kelvon. She was waiting, breathless, her violet eyes filled with urgency. This way, she whispered, grabbing his wrist and pulling him forward. Elias didn't resist. He didn't know if he could trust her, but he had no other options. She led him through a side passage, a maintenance tunnel barely large enough to fit 2 people. The sounds of approaching soldiers grew louder behind them, but Kelvon tapped a console, sealing the door shut just as the first security guards rounded the corner. They didn't stop running. Why are you helping me? Elias asked between breaths. Kelvon's grip tightened. Because they're afraid of you. He frowned. And that's a good thing. She glanced back at him. It means they're hiding something. And I want to know what. Elias didn't have time to question her further. The passage opened into a massive hangar bay. And there it was. A ship. Sleek, black, and unlike anything Elias had ever seen. It was small, probably only capable of holding 2 or 3 people, but it looked fast. Kelvon sprinted toward the control panel. I can override the docking protocols, but we have to move now. Elias turned toward the hangar entrance, just as the heavy doors began to open. Varlek stood there, surrounded by a full squad of heavily armed soldiers. But there was something off about him now. His expression wasn't just anger, it was something else. Desperation. Elias, he called out. Don't do this. Elias clenched his fists. Try and stop me. Varlek didn't move. Instead, he took a deep breath and said, Do you know why you survived, Elias? Why your body is reacting the way it is? Elias hesitated. Your kind is not normal. Varlek took a step forward, his voice lowering. Humanity is something we never expected, something the galaxy has kept hidden for millennia. And if you leave this station, you will force the universe to acknowledge the truth. Elias shook his head. I don't care about your secrets. Varlek's expression darkened. Then you should, because if the galaxy learns what humans truly are. His eyes locked onto Elias. They will never let you live. The words sent a cold chill down Elias's spine. Kelvon grabbed his arm. Elias, get in the ship. Now. The soldiers raised their weapons. Elias moved. He dashed toward the ship as gunfire erupted. Plasma bolts streaked past him, but his body reacted before his mind did, weaving between the shots like he had trained for years. He reached the ship's ramp just as Kelvon powered up the engines. The thrusters roared to life, sending a shockwave through the hangar. Elias turned, just in time to see Varlek watching him go. Not with rage, not with hatred, but with fear. Then the ramp sealed shut. The ship lurched, the docking clamps disengaging. Elias barely had time to strap into the co-pilot's seat before Kelvon yanked the controls. The ship blasted out of the hangar at impossible speed. Elias looked through the viewport, his breath catching in his throat. Outside, orbiting the station, was a fleet. Dozens of warships. Waiting. Preparing. For him. Kelvon cursed. They're going to try and intercept us. Elias's jaw tightened. Then let's see if they can keep up. And with that, they shot into the stars. Elias gripped the armrests of his seat as the ship roared forward, pushing against the limits of its thrusters. Kelvon's hands danced over the controls, her violet eyes sharp with focus. Behind them, the station's defense fleet moved into pursuit. "This ship is fast," Kelvon muttered, "but not that fast. If we don't shake them before we hit open space, they'll tear us apart." Elias exhaled sharply, his heart pounding. "What's the plan?" She glanced at him. "I was hoping you had one." Before he could respond, the ship shook violently as a warning alarm blared. "Missiles incoming," Kelvon shouted. Elias barely had time to react before the first explosion rocked the ship. The blast sent them spiraling, the stars twisting violently outside the viewport. Kelvon fought against the controls, struggling to stabilize them. Elias's instincts took over. His hands moved, grabbing the emergency countermeasure controls. He had never flown a ship like this before, but somehow he knew what to do. With a flick of his fingers, he deployed a series of decoy flares. The second wave of missiles veered off course, detonating harmlessly behind them. Kelvon's eyes widened. "How did you?" "I don't know," Elias admitted, his breath heavy. "I just felt it." Kelvon didn't question him further. There was no time. More ships closed in. Plasma cannons charged, their glowing barrels locking onto them. "We're out of options," Kelvon said. "I'm going to try something stupid." Elias barely had time to protest before she cut the main thrusters. The sudden loss of acceleration sent them into a dead drift. The enemy ships overshot them, their weapons firing into empty space. Then, in an instant, Kelvon reignited the engines, sending them into a steep dive toward the nearest planet. Elias's stomach lurched as the ship plunged into the atmosphere. The friction caused the hull to glow red-hot, shaking violently under the pressure. Hold together," Kelvon muttered, gripping the controls. Elias clenched his teeth. "You have a landing plan, right?" Kelvon smiled. "Not really." The ship hurtled toward the surface. Below them stretched a vast landscape. Endless forests, jagged mountains, and a massive river cutting through the valley like a silver blade. Kelvon yanked the controls at the last possible moment. The ship leveled out just above the treetops, skimming the canopy as they barreled forward at breakneck speed. Behind them, the enemy ships hesitated. "They won't follow us," Kelvon said. "Too risky at this altitude." Elias exhaled in relief, just as something massive loomed ahead. A fortress, built into the cliffs. Massive, ancient, and clearly alien. Kelvon's eyes widened. "That's impossible. That structure isn't supposed to exist." Elias frowned. "What is it?" Kelvon shook her head. "I don't know." Then, as if in response to their presence, the fortress came to life. Blue energy flared along its walls. Symbols, long forgotten by the galaxy, began to glow. And deep within Elias's chest, something stirred. Something that had been asleep for a very, very long time. His vision blurred. His pulse thundered. He had been here before. Somehow, He knew this place, and whatever lay inside, it was waiting for him. "You said." Elias felt the pull deep in his chest, a strange sensation, like a memory just beyond his grasp, a whisper in the back of his mind that said, "You've been here before." The ship hovered just above the ancient fortress, its blue energy pulsing like a heartbeat. Kel Vaughn struggled with the controls, her expression tense. "This place, it's interfering with our systems," she muttered. "I can't keep us in the air." Elias barely heard her. His gaze was locked on the fortress below, his breath coming in short, uneven gasps. Then, without thinking, he whispered, "Take us down." Kel Vaughn snapped her head toward him. "Are you crazy? That energy field. Trust me." She hesitated for only a second before nodding. With careful precision, she guided the ship toward a platform extending from the fortress. As soon as they touched down, the entire structure shuddered, as if it had been asleep and was only now awakening. Elias unbuckled his harness and stood. His hands trembled, though not from fear, from something else, something deeper. Kel Vaughn placed a hand on his shoulder. "Elias, what's happening?" He didn't have an answer. He stepped onto the platform. The air was thick with something ancient, something untouched for centuries, maybe longer. The blue energy danced along the stone walls, illuminating massive carvings. Carvings of humans. Elias's breath caught in his throat. There, etched into the walls of an alien fortress on a distant world, were images of his own kind. Kel Vaughn's voice was barely a whisper. "This is impossible." Elias stepped closer. The carvings told a story, one of war, of civilizations rising and falling. And in the center of it all, humanity. Not as conquerors, not as destroyers, but as something greater. Guardians. Elias's fingers traced the largest carving, a figure standing at the heart of a swirling galaxy. The moment his skin touched the stone, a pulse of energy surged through him. Memories, not his own, flooded his mind. He saw stars burning. He saw alien fleets kneeling before something unseen. He saw a great conflict, a war that had nearly destroyed the universe, and he saw them. Humans, a race that was never meant to be forgotten, a race that was never meant to be just another species. Elias staggered back, his vision swimming. Kel Vaughn caught him. "Elias, talk to me," he gasped, trying to form words. We weren't supposed to be like the others. Humanity." He looked up at her, his voice shaking. "We were the first." Kel Vaughn's eyes widened in shock. "What?" Elias turned back to the carvings, his mind racing. It all made sense now. The reason the galaxy had always tried to hide Earth. The reason humanity was treated as insignificant. The reason Varlek had been so afraid. The universe's greatest secret wasn't some forbidden technology. It was them. Humans were the original architects of the stars, the first race to walk among the cosmos, the ones who had set the foundations for the galaxy as it existed now. And then, for some reason, they had been erased. But not completely. Something deep within Elias had survived, something written into his very being. And now, the universe would remember. Kel Vaughn swallowed hard. "Elias, if this is true, if the galaxy finds out, they will come for you." Elias looked at her, and for the first time since this all began, he wasn't afraid. "Then let them come." He turned back toward the ship, his heart steady, his path clear. The galaxy had buried the truth for too long. It was time to wake it up. Humanity had returned.